Hello and welcome aboard, cadets, to part 2 of our look into the origins of the Bandit kingdoms. Today we will delve into the reconstruction of the periphery after the final surrender of the Astrian Conclave in 2596, which marked an official end to the reunification wars. The major periphery states officially joined the Star League in 2597, only a year after the surrender. At this point, the great boom in the periphery, sparked by Inner Sphere and SLEF charity works, reconstruction, and even improvements upon existing infrastructure and technology would begin. On a side note, it is also important to realize that most worlds had SLEF garrisons by now, so you had better be enjoying that boom in reconstruction right now, or let's just say you might find a laser round in the back of your skull. To quote a person from this time point on how the periphery felt about this, quote, "For what use is conquered territory unless it functions well enough for its inhabitants to pay taxes and tribute to their new overlords? No one wants to rule a wasteland. There's no money in it. So of course the Star League and its Inner Sphere corporate honchos are pouring their wealth into revitalizing our worlds. But not for us. They're feathering their own nests. That the actions they take to enrich themselves also helps us out a bit comes with the territory." From the radio outlet known as Bullhorn on Toria's capital of the Concordat, 12th of December 2599, end quote. Now, as time would go on, the citizens of the many periphery states and kingdoms would actually come to warm up to the Star League. To give you some perspective to this, during an interview with some random citizen from the streets of a periphery world out on the fringes of space, quote, "Nice to have those big mechs with their big guns pointed at the pirates. We used to hit round here, instead at us," end quote. Now, take some of these quotes as they are. There is good evidence and documentation behind some of these. However, this quote, for instance, has very little documentation behind it, though it comes from a period in which the periphery had major pirate problems, some of which were subsidized by the Inner Sphere, so there is no way to be certain of this claim, that this particular unquoted world, or even if this man is legitimately a periphery citizen. Such is the big gamble with BT lore. Right, moving on. Now, we do have irrefutable evidence of the benefits that the periphery states received from under the Star League. Some of these benefits would include security from external raids and pirate forces that come from the deep periphery, which, for those of you who don't know, the deep periphery refers to the space beyond the periphery, which the periphery is the fringes of the Inner Sphere. Out in the deep periphery, there is even less known about it, and even more mystery than on the periphery itself. For example, we do know some minor kingdoms and states exist in the deep, and there are colonies and independent worlds, much like the periphery out in the deep. However, lawlessness in space as a whole and infrastructure, including jump ships for travel, and definitely no HPGs, or in other words, hyperpulse generators, which help provide communication for multi-system states. We don't even know how many jump ships exist, or even function out in the deep. As a whole, very little is known about the deep periphery, so it's a little scary out there, which is probably why the worlds and many systems that border the deep unknown probably feel a lot safer with state-of-the-art tech and Star League forces watching out there in the great unknown, ever ready to respond to any threat. Another benefit of the Star League would be public schooling for the masses. Of course, Pro League and House Cameron teachings would take place here, and with the helps of gobs of money and resources from the Inner Sphere, public schooling, as well as increased Medicare and medical technology, would rapidly spread throughout the periphery during this period of reconstruction. Honestly, it's more akin to a phoenix rising at this point, rising from its ashes, stronger and more enlightened, than mere just reconstruction. Let's take a moment to talk about that maybe in a certain light the Star League was right. For example, they did bring a lot of civilization and security as well as knowledge to the periphery, with the clear intentions of using the periphery as a border state to keep bandits and raids out of the Inner Sphere space, all the while initially at least improving the standards of living across the periphery, improving roads, cities, power, resource gathering, and education as well as Medicare. Now that we have added that perspective, let's talk about how the Inner Sphere states regarded the periphery kingdoms bordering them as little resource piggy banks. The periphery's major resource industries would receive more funding than anything else. If that helps to give you an idea as to what the Inner Sphere's true intentions were, bearing in mind the Terran hegemony, while it played a role in this, would see less as much in terms of resources and more so see profit mostly from subsidies and taxation from the periphery kingdoms. The Inner Sphere funded mining, agriculture, and various forms of sweatshop-like industries. Also, mining would include asteroids as well as non-breathable worlds, which, let's just say, both of these things are extremely expensive to get set up, especially in the periphery. So they were investing a lot of money into developing the periphery, with the clear intentions of using them to build up the Inner Sphere states in the long run. The last major benefit, and probably the most important in stabilizing the resentment towards the Star League, would have to be the standards in living. However, while the initial boom saw the middle class expand, it did not take long for it to shrink. While this happened, the gap between the lower classes and the higher classes associated with the new Imperial Order would grow immensely. Now, as the Star League era went ever onwards, people within the periphery had originally sought to reform the Star League from within, to better suit the periphery states, whom of which were now members of. Resentment would sort of now begin to resurge in this time point, as many within the periphery had began to ask why their parents and grandparents, for all their toil with working with the system of the Star League, had things stagnated. Issues periphery worlds had to deal with were haphazardly addressed by their Star League overlords. Their autonomy, compared to that granted of the Great Inner Sphere states, who were also members of the Star League, who had far more autonomy, while the periphery had reached nothing past being a mere puppet. Worst of all, people still from the periphery were treated as second-class citizens of the Star League, and attempts for generations to be treated as equal member states had failed. All the while, more resources continued to pour out of the periphery with very little material gain in return. People throughout the periphery felt as though the soul and spirit was now lost, and for the most part, they were right. They were essentially puppets and vassal states of the Star League. I'm going to read a brief segment of periphery denizens thinking back towards the past, roughly about 30 years or so, after the Reunification War's end. Who are we now? 30 years on from the end of the Reunification War, it's time to take stock. Most folks are content to ask what we've gained, balance it against what we've lost, and pronounce the scales roughly even. A convenient mindset that it lets you indulge the desire to badmouth the Inner Sphere, a desire bred into the periphery folk ever since our ancestors first drew free breath, while imposing no obligation to act on your complaints, because when the scales are roughly even, what you've lost doesn't matter enough for you to risk bucking the system to get it back. What you've gained may be no great shakes, and you still grumble about the damned government every chance you get. But at base, you'll take what the Star League gives you. So who are we now? We know who we were. We were the intrepid ones, those willing to gamble everything for the freedom to make our own choices. We stood by those choices, even if we died for it. We asked for no handouts. We made our own luck. We made our own rules, and abided by them. Most of all, we took care of our own. We did all of this with what we had, what we made, what we couldn't make with, we did without. We met life head on, took its punches, shared its triumphs, and didn't whine when it dealt us tough hands. Take what comes and get on with it, as my grandma Jessie used to say. She died at 81, with a rifle in her hands, fighting off a Black Star pirates back in 2566. Some say that's gone now, phantoms of lost liberty. They tell us gone with the dead of the war, obliterated by 3 decades of sometime prosperity. A little extra money in our pockets after tax time, vaccines and free schooling for the children. Don't you remember what it was like, they say, when we had to struggle so hard just to make ends meet, when brigands and mechs could hit anywhere they pleased? When we didn't have planetary computer networks on almost every world and local nets in every city? Larger than 30,000 souls, remember? Yes, we remember. We also remember when we could call our worlds our towns, and our souls our own. We cherish that deep down, and not all the technology or Fox prosperity in the universe can make us forget it. It's not that we don't want prosperity or its advancements, technological, economic, and social, but we want to achieve them on our own, not to have them thrust on us by someone with a bayonet in his other hand. The Star League, for all its benefits, has denied us that accomplishment. How long will we, the descendants of the darers and dreamers, allow this situation to stand?
Alpharet's Outworlds Alliance, 11th of March, 2625, The Daily Beacon.
Now, many years later, in 2690, Jonathan Cameron would succeed his predecessor First Lord Michael of the Star League. Oddly enough, he ascended to the throne in an age of unprecedented peace and prosperity. So great was this peace through all the member states, and even that of the periphery, that Michael actually deigned to think about cutting down the SLDF budget, making it actually smaller. For the most part, officially, the periphery on paper could govern themselves, but not on a planetary level, let alone have any fair representation at the court on Terra. And with the great departure of SLDF units across the periphery, bearing in mind, of course, the garrison still held, just in smaller numbers, this would actually still a lot of resentment. However, not being able to hold the same level of power as their inner sphere counterparts over their own fates, unrest still continued, though peacefully. However, the Bureau of Star League Affairs agents, or BSLA for short, would become the targets of these supposed nonviolent protests. For the most part, nobody was actually harmed, though harassment and graffiti as well as slander was certainly flung in their directions. A quick note on the BSLA is they handle governmental affairs over the periphery states, while not actually being from the periphery, and in some cases handling decisions only on Terra for certain states, rather than having boots on the ground. This proxy-like administration, as one would probably reasonably imagine, would piss the hell out of the periphery states as well as their citizens. It would be the equivalent of Germany dictating what all European nations do, which I think is more than reasonably well-grounded as to what the basic reaction to that would be. Now, I'm going to quote another section of the Periphery sourcebook to help give you a better in-universe idea on the Periphery's perspective of how they sort of felt about it. Bureaucrats Go Home by Captain Kibbs. Alright, now let's get started. 2 days from now, the Magistracy of Canopus will celebrate the new year of 2704, and the century mark since the last occupying SLDF departed Canopian space. Now it's time for the other Star League army to take itself home. The army of bureaucrats foisted on us by the BSLA. For those in the government on Terra who don't think we can be trusted with the hovercar keys, we have a few pertinent questions. Haven't we kept the peace out here for a century now? Don't our resources and our people contribute mightily to the health of the interstellar economy? Haven't our planetary leaders accepted the Cameron's leadership even to the point of suppressing anti-Star League sentiment on some worlds, and providing peaceful outlets for it on many others? Why then must we still get permission from some periphery administrator to wipe our noses? If it's our armies that you worry about, let us set your mind at rest. The Edict of 2650 mandates damned small troop numbers compared to the SLDF. The Territorial State Security Act, remember that one, has kept us from getting our hands on any weapons much larger than pea shooters. More than 50 years, as far as we know, both laws remain in force. But even if they didn't, the Star League has nothing to fear from us. We are the Star League now, just as much as any Innersphere state member. We've lived with and profited from the reality ever since the end of the reunification wars. Does anyone in the House Cameron seriously believe that any periphery government intends to change it now? All we want is a fair shake. Let us run our own affairs, our way. Just like the governments of the Inner Sphere, you have our greater friendship to gain and nothing to lose. Op-Ed Canopian Daily Herald, 30th of December, 2703. Now, this sort of continued outreach towards the Camerons would actually have an impact. It would lead to Directive 41, which would be issued by the current newly anointed First Lord Jonathan Cameron of the Star League. Now, while there is strong evidence to suggest that the Camerons truly felt for the plight of the periphery, but for all their good intentions, major houses, quite simply put, did not. However, Directive 41 came at an opportune time. The Federated Suns and Draconis Combine were caught in wars of succession, while the Free Worlds League was in a midst of a civil war, and had just very recently, obviously, disrupted the age of prosperity and peace we had just mentioned earlier. So some could say the SLDF, not wanting to spread itself too thin, did not really want to risk conflict with the periphery. In 2722, our lad, current reigning Cameron, signed Directive 41, which transferred regulatory power from the BSLA to the many periphery governments. Public reaction across the periphery was joyous, and people genuinely praised the Camerons in a joyous chorus throughout the periphery. For now, instead of key locations experiencing the true benefits of being part of the Star League, all worlds within each kingdom and state could experience these wonders equitably from world to world and system to system throughout the periphery. Well, that's what it said on paper anyways. It took about several months for the effects to be truly felt in the periphery. Instead of the BSLA controlling regulatory control, they did not realize that they had exchanged it for a sort of pay-to-play system of government, which decision-making power goes to the highest bidder. Yeah. Fuck. It also did not take long for the chunky-dunky inner sphere houses to brutally fuck the situation yet further. The next 3 decades, the periphery was being sucked dry by the inner sphere of all resources, sort of like a kid eating a milkshake. The Camerons also profited wholesale from this exchange, if you will, as money found its way to Jonathan Cameron, which he so oddly invested into enlarging the SLDF budget even more in the face of restored peace. A little bit odd, that one. Now, the Reform the League from Within party had hoped for a fresh, clean slate when Simon Cameron ascended the throne in 2738. A man who is definitely blunt and honest. A person who looked very promising to the Camerons of old. They had even hoped that he would greatly change Directive 41 and crack down on inner sphere state meddling. Now, it was also known the Cameron was opposed to the SDS installations constructed throughout the periphery, which are essentially little garrisons and bases. To which Simon did indeed cancel the SDS project. But before the champagne bottles could be popped open in the periphery, it was revealed to why the project was cancelled. Instead of tiny, kawaii little bases everywhere, it was massive motherfucking installations capable of withstanding waves of cluster-fucking nuke attacks. Yeah. It is important to note that the RimWorld's Republic was the only one still chanting, "Go Starly, go!" That being said, it is also important to note that that was the Ameris family chanting that. So much so was the support of the Ameris family of the RimWorld's Republic that it almost seemed that they were gleefully handing over major activists. I'd be suspicious of this, but hey, everyone was too busy to really take too much note on this. There is another thing to remember while this is all happening. Manufacturing companies throughout the periphery were shitting out tons of mech units, tanks, weapons, and the likes, secretly funded, of course, and supported by local governments and secessionist movements. Now, they were stockpiling this stuff in the background, so nobody would know about it. So that's another thing to note really quickly, that there's a massive weapons buildup taking place right now. Now, production would continue to be cranked up, and in 2740s, Simon Cameron, a wise ruler and very keen to small details, noticed the discrepancy in unknown buyers in the periphery, which led him to believe that the periphery was violating the Edict of 2650, which did not allow the periphery states to fully rearm to the pre-unification levels. Which this is what caused him to construct the massive fortifications throughout the periphery, as well as prepare the SLDF for possible rebellion within the League. However, this same move is what prompted them to amp up their productions. Now, if you're starting to wonder, there is an unknown variable here that is pulling at the strings of both the Terran hegemony and that of the Star League, as well as the periphery, further pushing that resentment. Now, to give you some perspective here, Simon Cameron did not want conflict, and in fact sought to right some of the wrongs done to the periphery. However, this unknown variable had pushed tensions so great that fear of conflict breaking out was reaching dire levels. This left Simon with only 2 choices. 1, preemptive strike the periphery and try to force them to heal again, which would further drive the schism to an abysmal level that they may never heal from. Or 2, tour the periphery in an attempt to show that Simon was committed to the periphery and its welfare, that they are a Star League member. He would address their concerns and work on a solution to grant them the same level of self-autonomy as well as any other concerns they had. Simon chose the second option, to leave Terra for a 5-year tour, and left for the RimWorld's Republic. He arrived at Silesia in February 2751, a mining colony at Star's End, where within mere hours, Simon Cameron was killed in a fatal mining accident. This concludes Part 2 of the Bandit Kingdom's origins. In Part 3, we will be going over the fall of the Star League as well as the Ameris Civil War, which led not only to the Star League's collapse, but that of the independence of the Periphery Kingdoms. In Part 4, which will be the final part, thank fucking God, it's a massive series, we will go over the Succession Wars and what the Periphery's Kingdoms and how that sort of impacted them as well. And then that will finally conclude where the Periphery Kingdoms are today. So in this segment, we got to see, basically resentment on the rise. We did get to see that, they did have a lot more moments of benefit and stuff, but the Periphery's documentation is mostly of a negative light. The Star League goes over more stuff that they benefited from that they don't even want to acknowledge. But that'll be done in the Star League's, obviously, lore video, which Star League will do last. That'll be the last thing we do, because they're so cool, they're so epic, they deserve their own thing. The Bandit Kingdoms are a great place to start, because, out in the fringes, where the Inner Sphere begins, is the best place to begin with Battletech lore. But yeah, we'll do it that way. But yeah, until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's lore video, and this is your host, Captain Gibbs, signing off. Have yourselves a glorious day.